There is a phrase we use back in the country. It says, "Be without food, but don't be without shelter or home." Shelter is very important than food. I was working as much as you can work. Like 3 jobs. Even with all of those efforts, I couldn't afford to even get a little bit time with the kids.
At the age of 16, I entered the American foster care system. I've pulled myself out of some pretty bad spots, but I needed housing, and what I was making was just not cutting it at the time.
How can a family grow and prosper if they don't have a home that they can afford in a decent neighborhood?
In the past several years, the situation has become more urgent than we've seen even 10 years ago. It has implications for people's lives.
There are so many American families that don't have enough income to afford rental housing. Half of the renters in this country are paying more than 30% of their income for housing.
The low-income housing tax credit allows investors to invest money in housing and get credits, and the result is funds to build additional low-income housing.
The Section 8 vouchers are the primary way to help people afford housing.
Vouchers are a way for a resident to get into an apartment that costs more than what they can afford with their 30% of budget allocated to housing.
There definitely would have been a lot more detours, a lot more failures, a lot more uncertainty.
Now I know that I can enjoy the life, being with the kids, and have a brighter future.
First off, I think housing is a nonpartisan issue, but I certainly believe that the bipartisan approach to solving it is what needs to happen.
Every social goal that we want for the people of the United States revolve around housing. A precondition for making progress is to have a decent place to say, tonight I'm going home to rest. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today, both virtually and here in person at the Bipartisan Policy Center. My name is Henry Cisneros, and as chairman of BPC's Board of Directors, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this important conversation on one of the most pressing issues facing our country, the nation's housing affordability crisis. A crisis of availability of housing, of pricing of housing, of effects such as homelessness, one that touches lives of people of all ages, affects careers and the quality of life in communities. From urban centers to rural communities, the lack of affordable housing is a growing concern for millions of Americans. As this crisis escalates, it's crucial that governments at all levels and the private sector come together to identify and implement strategies that can make housing more accessible for all Americans. The BPC has made a major commitment to housing. BPC is led by Margaret Spellings, our president, and under Margaret's leadership, we put a major emphasis upon dealing with bipartisan solutions to the housing crisis. Today's event involves three organizations: the BPC, which is the host, as you can see here today, a role that we play on many issues. This room is used almost every day for some major gathering in Washington. Another organization is BPC's Terwilliger Center, the first center created on a specific policy area by the BPC, named in honor of Ron Terwilliger and his endowment. It's run by Dennis Shea, who is seated here today, and the focus is on housing solutions of a bipartisan character. Today's event also involves another effort called the National Housing Crisis Task Force. The National Housing Crisis Task Force is a collaboration between Accelerator for America, which is a group of mayors across the country who got their start in national policy working on infrastructure, and the NOAC Metropolitan Finance Lab at Drexel University. Mary Ellen Wiederwall is the head of Accelerator for America, and Bruce Katz, who is here, is the head of the National Housing Crisis Task Force. It's run by Ben Price. The task force was created to elevate local and state best practices. Let me underscore that. Local and state best practices in housing, which can be replicated across the country and directly address the housing crisis issues. I'm pleased to serve as a member of that task force, which met in this room just yesterday and is working to uncover the most promising innovations that can be scaled to address the housing crisis. The Terwilliger Center and the National Housing Crisis Task Force share a commitment to identifying innovative housing solutions and advancing practical bipartisan policy recommendations to increase the supply of affordable homes. Today, this panel is focused on exploring promising strategies to achieve key housing reforms and to advance innovations across land use, construction, capital access, housing finance, and housing delivery, areas that, when aligned across federal, state, and local governments, can lead to the kinds of changes that we know the sector needs. We have an outstanding panel of experts with us today who will be sharing insights about what's working on the ground and how we can better collaborate to scale those solutions so they can have national impact. Moderating our discussion is Katie O'Donnell, financial services reporter at Politico, who has covered housing policy extensively. We look forward to the insights from our panel today and the ideas that will emerge for how we can continue building the partnerships necessary to solve the housing crisis. So thanks again for joining us. I'll now turn it over to Katie to get us started.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So today we have Aaron Schroyer, who's the Director of Housing Policy at the National Economic Council. We have Michael Kelly, who is the Director of BPC Action. Steve Waldrop is a Senior Advisor for Housing Strategy and Innovation for the state of Utah. And then we have Kenzie Bach, who is an Administrator at the Boston Housing Authority. So let's get started. Aaron, I wanted to start with you. So the Biden administration Housing Supply Action Plan has pledged to close the supply gap within 5 years. But we're hearing about issues with financing, regulatory compliance, and workforce shortages. So what is the administration doing, and what can it do to kind of address these barriers?
Sure. Thanks for that question. And before I jump in, I do just want to say, typically when I speak at forums such as these, I disclose when I begin my remarks that you may hear me stutter when I speak, and that's just the way that I talk. So to your question, since day one, the president and VP have put forward a bold plan for housing that would make record investments that would reduce or potentially close the supply gap that we've seen, and you've seen these investments made through Build Back Better and through the budgets that have followed. So we think of the supply action plan as a real complement to those proposals, in that the goal of the plan is in anticipation of more funding from the Hill, to figure out basically how to improve programs, so to make them more efficient and more effective. So the main pillars of the supply action plan are to incentivize state and local government to make pro housing reforms, to improve the federal financing programs that we have, and really just to make the federal programs easier to work with. We also think of the supply action plan as a living document. So as Katie said, it came out first in May of 2022. We have crossed off most of that list in that first document, but we've also added more to it. So things like conversions of office to residential, looking at suitable federal lands that we can dispose for housing. These are things that were not really contemplated in the 1.0 version that came out of the plan in 2022. But as we have gotten some ideas, we have tried to incorporate and to use our federal muscles where we can to address them. So just one example that I'll mention is DOT has these two lending programs. One's called TIFIA, one's called RIF, and those were started a few decades ago, really to do things like build toll roads. And so those were not being well used. So Congress within the last decade has expanded the uses for those programs to include residential construction, but in doing so didn't change the rules of the program to make it look more like a conventional residential lending program. So we have really taken the action to effectively shoehorn in a residential lending program to something that's not set up to really do that. So through webinars with developers, local governments, we have found ways to chip away at the non-statutory parts of this program that have prevented it from being used for housing. And I'm proud to say that we are close to closing our first loan in this program. And there's a really big pipeline of loans that we think that we can close in the last year, or in the next year, excuse me.
Great. So now turning to Congress, Mike, it seems like voters routinely cite housing affordability as one of their top issues. And according to a recent BPC poll, The public strongly supports policy proposals to increase access to affordable housing, but bipartisan legislation is struggling to get traction. So I'm wondering what you think, kind of, why has it been so difficult for the 118th Congress to kind of move on meaningful housing legislation?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, it's good to be at my own office. Thanks for having me. I think generally it's hard to do anything in Congress, and I think the last 2 years has been historical in and of itself, in that you've seen a sitting speaker removed. At the beginning of Congress, you saw, I think, 16 votes to even get a speaker. So I don't know if 118th Congress should be the barometer for what Congress can or cannot do, but I think the biggest thing is affordable housing, I think, means different things to different members, to different parties. If you take the Republican side, affordable housing might mean, increased access to mortgages. You could mean, removing regulatory barriers to increase supply of housing. On the Democrat side, it might mean more public investment in public housing. It might mean, helping, more low-income and very low-income renters find a place to live, increasing the voucher funding. So I think, and both sides are perfectly acceptable and meaningful policy positions to have. I just think that's kind of where the disconnect has been. I think historically Republicans, pretty much since the financial crisis of 08, 09, 2010, their focus in the housing space has been primarily getting Fannie and Freddie out of conservatorship. I think what we've seen in our work here at BPC is, over the last few years, Republicans are probably rightfully so shifting away from that focus, because if it hasn't happened yet, it might not any time in our lifetime. I would say maybe the second Trump administration would disagree with that take, and as you saw at the end of the first Trump administration, there was movement to get Fannie and Freddie out of conservatorship. But I think that's probably the biggest thing, aside from the macro of it's hard to do anything in Congress. There's kind of a divergence between the two parties on what is affordable housing. Now, I will say, what we've seen at BBC and the Terwilliger Center and our polling has shown is that there is broad consensus on increasing supply of affordable housing and housing in general. I think the estimates are anywhere between 4 to 5 million units that we're short, and that's across renting and home ownership. So I'm hopeful that the next Congress, maybe I shouldn't be, but I'm hopeful that the 119th Congress can get its act together and start addressing some of these issues, because there are a number of bipartisan bills, many of which we have endorsed at BBC Action, that can address some of these issues.
So Steve and Kenzie, as members of the National Housing Crisis Task Force, what have been your biggest takeaways on how kind of federal, state, local governments and agencies can work together to address this issue?
Are we answering together? Or
Yeah.
Go ahead.
You're ladies first.
Yeah, I think, it's been a very encouraging group to be part of, because I think that what we see is that just about every tool that we need in the toolkit to solve the housing crisis it exists and it's being used somewhere in America. And already states and cities were learning from each other. I'll take an example. My Mayor Michelle Wu, just announced a few weeks ago that in Boston we're launching a housing accelerator fund, which is really borrowing from the Montgomery County, Maryland model of looking at how we can use public finance to have lower cost equity to get some of these permitted but not moving housing developments off the drawing board and into reality. And that's an example, right, where we're learning from Montgomery. Other folks around the country are looking at that model as well. But I think that even with something like that, what we see is, yes, we can learn a lot from each other, but it would be even better with serious federal backing. So, when we talk about a public finance solution to housing production, putting that type of thing together involves courting mezzanine lenders, getting housing finance agencies to know how to set up that type of model. And you can do that at each level, but gee, I mean, one of the things that the federal government can really do is provide at scale the kind of public finance support that would make that easily replicable. So I think what's great is that cities and towns and states are not waiting, and it's been wonderful on the task force to learn from each other, but part of the federal agenda that the task force will be coming out with is really about saying how can the federal government support those innovations that are happening at the local level.
Yeah, and I'd echo that. I think we're really grateful as state of Utah to be a part of this effort. Our Governor Cox has identified a target of 35,000 starter homes. That's not the only issue that we have, but that's an important kind of shorthand for addressing the crisis. And one of the things that we're focusing on is this access to the American dream. And what we're seeing right now is that access to home ownership is historically we had issues with limited by race and other policies. Now we're seeing it limited by generation. And if we get to where we have a generation that doesn't have access at the same rates that we've had in the past, we're going to see a really changed social structure. And our view is that the National Housing Crisis Task Force is a really critical piece because there are things that the federal government, they're the only ones that can do it. We have subsidized housing needs. We have things that have to be done at that macro national level to provide for housing in that bottom quartile of the need. But right now, we're also seeing this expanded role for state and local governments to help in market rate housing, which is really something we haven't seen since probably the 1930s, where we now have access issues for people who traditionally, teachers and firefighters and first responders and nurses and even college professors, we're seeing that access to ownership really limited in those groups in a way that has not been the case because the price of housing relative to wages that gap has widened so dramatically that it's impacted our traditional financing structures no longer work for those individuals and groups, and it's something that we now have to engage in from a state and local level, and we're really grateful for the tools that we're creating here.
Aaron, to Kenzie and Steve's point, there is kind of this tension between local and state governments and the federal government in terms of addressing this crisis. And it does seem like a lot of the crisis kind of is driven at the local level, zoning policies, land use policies. So I'm wondering what the administration can do to kind of help ease the path for state and local governments to build more housing.
Sure. So there's three main things that we're doing. First is that HUD has a first of its kind program called Pro Housing that is funding these governments to identify and remove barriers to building more housing. So HUD just put out its first tranche of funds. Just awarded, I believe, 22 cities this summer. The NOFO for the second round just closed last week. So in total, there's $185 million that's going to be awarded for this. But it's important to note that the demand for these funds is super high. So that first round of funding was just for $85 million. HUD had 1.3 billion in applications come in for that funding. So it's like a 13-to-1 of demand outstripping what they got from Congress to fund that. So that's one. Two is that we have worked with DOT and within their pots of funding that are competitive, where they have more control over how the applications get scored. We've worked with them to include preference points for jurisdictions that include more housing in the corridors that they're pursuing these funds for. So I think that the best example that folks might know are what's called RAISE grants that can do things like help to build streetcars or bus rapid transit. But there's a few other programs where we, in the past few years, there's been roughly $20 billion that have gone out with this sort of enhanced preference points. And then I think the third is just to promote research. So this movement for pro-housing is quite young, and people don't know, what reforms work best and in what context. So HUD in the last year just awarded $4 million to researchers to attack this question and to then help folks learn from what they're doing, so that the sort of reform curious mayor that comes along next, that there's a playbook that they can pull from.
Gotcha. Kenzie, as of 2021, roughly 20,000 households in Boston received tenant-based housing vouchers, and it's, as is common through much of the U.S., there are long wait lists. They're faced challenge regarding long wait lists, source of income discrimination, increasing landlord sort of participation in the program. How can federal and state governments sort of ease that path?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. And yeah, we're really proud at the Boston Housing Authority to support so many families with the federal Housing Choice Voucher Program, and actually with a small state voucher program as well in Massachusetts. And it just, that support for households really works, and it's a lifeline for keeping people in our city and in our region. So we actually administer throughout the whole metro region in Boston. A couple of thoughts. One is that the biggest thing that has moved the needle, and we're very proud that in Boston we actually now have more than 99% utilization rate of our vouchers. So we have really cracked the code of getting people to be able to use their vouchers to lease up. And the number one thing was switching to something called small area fair market rents and giving that voucher the purchasing power that people need in every zip code in the region. It used to be that they could only use it functionally in places that were below the median rent for the region. That meant a clustering of vouchers, and it meant a ton of places off the table for our families. So we made that change, and it's been a game changer. And at the end of the day, although source of income discrimination is something that we do continue to battle, and it's a very important affirmatively furthering fair housing thing for us, the reality is you don't even get to source of income discrimination if the voucher that people are holding just doesn't pay the rent that's being requested. I think the challenge that we're seeing is that more and more housing authorities like ours have made that switch to SAFMRs, and HUD has encouraged many to do it. We did it voluntarily. But what you're seeing is, because rental inflation is outpacing inflation in general, the cost of maintaining those programs is going up, and the appropriation line item in Congress is not matching. And so half the housing authorities in the country are in what's called shortfall right now, where they can't issue new vouchers because we're bumping right up against that appropriation ceiling. And HUD has actually had to collect reserves from other housing authorities to help make them whole. And so I would just say, I actually think that the voucher program is something where, there really should be a bipartisan consensus. We have a large landlord community across the country that takes these vouchers, that recognizes that it's a win-win when the federal government is backstopping somebody's rent, and we're able to make sure that families of all incomes can live, everywhere in America. And so I think it's a program that one of the things we're really going to need from the 119th Congress is a commitment to an appropriation level that funds the program at a rate where you can actually use the voucher successfully, right? Because there's no point having vouchers in theory that people can't use in practice. And I just want to underscore that is a really important piece of the puzzle.
Got it. Steve, last year, Governor Cox announced Utah Home, a new set of administrative priorities, including expanding housing access and addressing homelessness. And I wanted you to know if you could kind of walk us through how progress is going on that and what challenges you're running into and sort of what the outlook looks like.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. And again, going back to that initial comment, there are things that only the federal government can do. And being here in D.C., I feel like I've just jumped into the swamp. I'm trying to get up above for air, but we're doing our best. And one of the things that we're looking at is how do we integrate those things that at a certain income level, below a certain income level, projects don't pencil. You're not going to get developers to come in and sacrifice themselves on the altar of affordable housing. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the great challenges of creating housing at what has now become a greater income levels than traditionally we've had to deal with. We've usually had to deal with, subsidized housing in the 30% and below AMI range, and now we're up to maybe 50%, where, again, kind of like we just heard, there's a greater gap in rent pricing and what's required to create the housing in our inflationary cycle that we're in, and the cost of housing has gone up so dramatically. So we've had some success in pairing those federal grants with new state tax credit to create opportunity for developers to come in and be willing to enter into that space. One of the things that we're doing also is doing our land use restrictions on these subsidized deals up to 50 years. Traditionally, it's been about 15 years, and what happens when you have a federal subsidy that expires after 15 years, you're creating a windfall where those projects that have been subsidized now all of a sudden fall out of that subsidy range. You've got market forces that are going to drive those rent prices up, and we're taking people who are in a certain living situation. We're saying, hey, we're going to warehouse you here for 15 years. Now we're just going to take you and put you somewhere else. And so we want to increase that timeline to 50-year windows where that windfall doesn't happen in kind of that short-term time frame, which makes the projects more sustainable long-term, helps people more long-term. And then hopefully in that time frame, we also have some tools to recapitalize those projects. I know there's some new federal tools in that space as well. So that area is really an area of focus because that is one of the places where government has to step in. There is no alternative for the marketplace to deal with those issues without government subsidy. So we've had some success in that space with that combination of federal and state programming. We're looking at doing more. As the federal government subsidies increase, to the extent that they do, then we'll add more state volume to that as well and find those solutions, I think, in more volume. And that volume is frankly needed right now.
Go ahead. Can I say one thing, just piggybacking on Steve? I think that something that's really struck me lately is, we tend to talk about housing affordability in this country in terms of like different income brackets. And like Steve said, it's creeping up in terms of who can't afford to live in communities. But I also think it's really important to think about it as stages of life. So I think that actually a really thing that we can agree on in a bipartisan way is that a community is broken if elders cannot stay there and children cannot grow up there, right? Like these are the phases of life that we all expect and hope to go through. And so a dynamic in so many of our cities where if you have young kids and the cost of childcare is a direct trade-off with working for at least one parent, like the math to live in that place just no longer works. And then if you're a senior who's lived there your whole life and you're on a fixed income, the rental inflation is outpacing the COLA that you're getting for your fixed income. Like these are just structural problems that are affecting people on the like two ends of life that we all hope to go through. And like that's got to be a sort of like, a thing that we can come together around addressing in our communities.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. My next question is actually for you, Kenzie. So some of the housing stock in Boston is some of the oldest in the country. And this seems like a problem that's sort of, in pockets of the US. You have this old housing stock and everyone's talking about sort of building more new housing, and it's actually cheaper to rehabilitate existing units that we already have, but it still requires some money. And so I'm wondering, what can the federal government do? What can federal and state governments do to help public housing agencies repair and rehabilitate aging housing stock?
Yeah, so I mean, the number one thing is that we need significant federal support for this. Like it is, again, the way math works, if we subtract a bunch of units from the total in our communities, then that doesn't help us get to the net supplies like addressing either. So, and that is one thing that we lost in the transition from Build Back Better to the Inflation Reduction Act. And so I think we're going to continue to look for the 119th Congress to really like come up with that funding that we need for, in Boston, there are many, many neighborhoods of the city where low-income people are only able to live because of housing we built in the 1940s and 1950s. And they remain totally critical residents of those neighborhoods, but without a recommitment to something that, frankly, we've gotten really good value out of, right? It's 80-year-old housing, and it's housed a lot of families, and there's tons of people who've been really successful in the city who grew up in this housing. It's a very important resource for us, but we do need that federal commitment. I will say that we do see both the state and the city stepping in with significant dollars. So in the last 5 years, just actually mostly in the last couple of years under Mayor Wu, we've gone from the city of Boston not having any capital funding for the federal public housing, which makes sense because it was a federal program, to now there's $200 million in the city's capital budget for the Boston Housing Authority for exactly this, for rehabilitating housing, which is a huge skin in the game coming at the local level. And we just saw the largest state housing bond bill in Massachusetts history under Governor Maura Healey just pass at the end of July. So I would say that the city and state level, at least where we are, is actually coming up with money. Another really key piece is actually green retrofit funds, including funds that are included in the Inflation Reduction Act. I think that folks don't always recognize that some of the things that we need in order to make our housing greener and healthier, it's also just the core system needs. Like if you can replace windows and ventilation and boilers and roofs, like these are the things that make our buildings tighter from an energy envelope perspective, but they're also the things that make them higher quality for people to live in and get us those additional decades. So I think there's a good opportunity, and we're definitely at the Housing Authority. We've got the city's first network geothermal pilot launching at one of our sites, and we're really looking at how to use all the tax credits from the federal bills, both the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, to help tackle the problem you described.
Steve, Utah has implemented some zoning and land use reforms in recent years, including a 2021 law to allow accessory dwelling units. And I'm wondering, what kind of lessons have you learned from facing opposition to zoning reforms? And then also, once the zoning reform is accomplished, I feel like we all kind of talk about zoning reform as this ideal, but then once it actually happens, what are sort of the next hurdles to getting housing actually built?
It's a great question. I think one of the issues that we've seen is, this tension between local government, which is enabled by state government, but views itself as a separate entity, and then you've also got the residents who view their, kind of bundle of sticks of property rights. I think traditionally we viewed those bundle of sticks as really small, and that bundle of sticks has grown dramatically where people feel like they have a right to their views, and they have a right to limited traffic, and they have a right to, other things that they're sort of extending themselves beyond what their traditional rights are as property owners. And that's one of the battles that we fight with zoning reform. With respect to the ADU ordinance, it's been okay. What we've seen is that when state government comes in and sort of does this forced march on local governments, there's a natural pushback, and local governments are really, really good at figuring out ways to not comply. And they have that set of tools, and it's really hard because then you get into a game of whack-a-mole with local governments. Well, they're doing this. Okay, now we got to knock that thing down. Okay, now they're thwarting it this way. And so what we're really trying to do, we're working with our League of Cities and Towns, our counties, to create unified front housing reform, zoning reform, because otherwise, as we've seen across the country, end up in lawsuits. We've got lawsuits in Montana and Texas and Oregon and Boston and other places where sometimes you have to have that fight. But if you can avoid that fight and get kind of joint wins in that space, then it goes a lot longer and it goes quicker. So we're looking at our next package of zoning reforms to be sort of a joint effort between the league, between the mayors, who, frankly, most of them want to do the right thing. They've got pressures from their residents that are pushing back against the four-letter word that we now know across the country is density. And so creating those, and I think going back to what Katie said, creating those neighborhoods where you have the opportunity to start, live, and then finish in that neighborhood and have mixed income communities that are just more healthy. That's really our focus, providing homeownership opportunities for those who are starting out, but then not making it so that people that are transitioning at the end are locked in. And that's one of the big issues we're seeing right now, is that lock-in mortgage rate issue that we're confronting across the country. The market is significantly locked in because there's a downsizing penalty and there's an upsizing penalty right now. And so that's sort of the next front, I think, in this battle, is trying to figure out how we can unlock that natural movement, but again, in a way that respects the markets, because the markets will win in the end. They always do. And part of the goal is just trying to figure out how to get governments to support the markets in an appropriate way that allows people to do the things that they naturally want to do. And avoiding fights is challenging, but the work on the front end is really valuable and worth it at the end.
So Aaron and Mike, we have an election in 12 days, which I'm sure you guys have noticed. So what are the most promising kind of congressional legislative ideas that you think could actually break through? I mean, regardless of who's in Congress next year, I think it's safe to say we're going to have some gridlock. And so what do you think breaks through that gridlock? And then how do you see this election shaping housing policy in the next few years? Mike, if you want to start.
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to let everyone know, Steve and I are actually the same height. My chair is just a little lower. I think the biggest thing next year, and Aaron knows this, is tax. It's all about tax next year. Aside from the normal appropriations process, NDAA process, normal political votes that will always take place regardless of who's in power, is you have the expiration of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act at the end of next year. And so that's going to dominate, and it's already somewhat dominating right now, the conversation on the Hill next year. So I'd point to two bills in the housing space that I think are ripe for inclusion of any sort of extension or reauthorization or whatever you want to call it of TCJA, and that's the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, which would boost the light tech credits, and the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, which would create a new tax credit to kind of fill that value gap between redevelopment or reconstruction of a house and then the post-reconstruction or post-development of value or appraisal of the house. So those are both bipartisan, bicameral bills. They have been for the last few Congresses. The LIHTC bill was actually, or at least a portion of it was included in the Smith-Wyden bipartisan tax bill earlier this year that overwhelmingly passed the House, and maybe I shouldn't say is dead in the Senate, maybe on life support in the Senate since the Congress isn't yet over. And then you'll probably see there's been a flurry of other tax-specific bills. I think it was Jimmy Gomez from California just introduced the first-time homebuyer tax credit. So you'll probably see a number of bills and pet projects, probably the wrong word, but specific bills that members care about that they'll try to attach to anything that moves next year. And
I'd second what Mike says. Those two bills that he mentioned are they've both been features in the president's budgets in recent years, and I think just given the overwhelming support that they have, would if you're forecasting and looking ahead, probably would have the best chance of passage. The one thing I'd add to what Mike said is that you're seeing some standalone bills looking at regulatory reforms that have been proposed. There's a Fetterman bill. There's a few others, and so I think that one could potentially see there being a package that's the two bills that Mike mentioned, plus some other regulatory relief to ensure that the homes that get funded through those bills can actually get built.
If the future maybe chairman of Senate Banking is listening, holding a hearing, holding a markup on a lot of these bipartisan bills would be awesome, or the current chairman, quite frankly. And then there's no shortage of bills that outside the tax space I think could easily at least get through committee and move forward in the process that we just haven't seen probably since HOTMA, my good friends here who helped shepherd that through the Congress a couple years ago. But hopeful that there is, I think every member is hearing from their constituents across all 435 districts and all 50 states that housing is a huge issue, and housing affordability, housing supply is a huge issue, and if not now, when?
I just want to remind everyone, both in person and online, that we're going to have some time for questions. So if you have a question, we'll probably have a few minutes at the end. Mike, to go back to you for a second, one of the things that that's sort of been a theme of the conversation so far is, the fact that local governments are sort of on the ground and actually responsible for a lot of the policies that drive up the cost of housing, but everyone wants Washington to do something about it. And so what can Congress, I guess, how can Congress craft legislation that works for all different kinds of communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kenzie, you could probably answer this just from being on the ground and doing the work every day outside of the tax space. And I'll answer this not from a my BPC hat, but more of a Republican hat. In that, I think if you talk to a lot of Republicans on the Hill, historically they would say housing issues should be dealt with at the state and local level, and that's what today is all about. And generally, they think that the federal government should get out of the way, right, and just let the state and local, be it city, be it county level, started dealing with some of these issues. Again, answering from a Republican point of view, I think if you talk to some of the more thoughtful members in the House and Senate on housing issues, there are things the federal government can do that you may not think are entirely related to housing, that are not LIHTC or vouchers, in that Davis-Bacon laws, NEPA, permitting reform. I think those are things that Congress could do. I'm not saying they will do, but they could do to help permitting reform, right? To help streamline and get things out of the way for people to start building and actually increasing supply. Aaron probably disagrees with me on that, but I do think that if you again, the more thoughtful members on the Republican side, that will come up now and now again. And I will say permitting maybe is probably the best shot right now, because there has been a lot of, obviously a lot of permitting reform was done in IIJA, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and I think still more could be done to help developers across the country start putting more shovels in the ground and building units.
And now I want to sort of open this up for everyone. If there was like one sort of silver bullet, or I guess not a silver bullet, but if there's one legislative thing that you could accomplish in the next few years, whether it's federal, state, local, to make the biggest dent in the affordable housing crisis, what would it be?
So I think one of the themes that we've heard from the panel is the need for more funding, whether it be state, local, federal, and so I think more funding, but also funding that is easy to deploy. One of the lessons learned that we've had from the state and local funds from the rescue plan is that local governments found those easier to work with, and they've deployed something like $7.5 billion of them to boost supply. So I think it is more funding and funding that's easy to deploy.
Do you want Mike Kelly's answer or BPC? I'm just kidding.
I want both. Give us both.
I think one thing, again, I think it goes back to, from a Republican point of view, removing some of these regulatory barriers that are in the way. I always quote our friends at the National Home Builders. They were presented our advisory committee a couple of years ago, and they had this slide that on average, units across America, close to 100K, goes into a unit before a shovel goes into the ground. And I think that's a huge problem that, before you even start to build the unit, developers are, spending that much money to comply with whatever, federal, state, local regulatory requirements there are. One other thing, given that I worked at HUD, we all love HUD, a lot of HUD people here. I think there's an opportunity for maybe next Congress, maybe future Congresses, to look at a HUD reform package, a HUD reauthorization package. Outside of NDAA or FAA or the Farm Bill, most agencies probably could have a fresher look at some of their programs. I think if you talk to a lot of Republicans, they would say there are a lot of programs at HUD that are duplicative, and that might free up additional money for a program like CDBG that is widely popular among mayors and local officials. That I think CDBG hasn't been upped, dramatically upped or kept up with inflation for years. So I think there are things that can be done within Congress and Congress's authority, i.e. oversight of an agency like HUD, that could go a long way to help streamlining programs, maybe even eliminating programs, plussing up programs that could help address some of the supply issues and affordability challenges we see today.
Yeah, I think those are thoughtful comments. You know, the baseline view I think that we have is that there's not enough government money to solve this crisis. There never will be. We can't tax and spend our way out of a housing crisis because, again, we're not just talking about what traditionally, you know, federal government's worried about, which is low-income housing or, you know, affordable housing. We're now talking about the structure of the housing market being really impacted up to, you know, people who, again, traditionally would be homeowners. And so we're not holding our breath. Sorry, guys. Sorry, DC. For Congress to solve this problem. You know, we're kind of in our own world, as you can see. We don't wear ties out there, and we just do our own thing. But the reality is that for us, the baseline is that state and local cooperation to identify the issues. One of them is zoning, clearly. One of them is regulatory reform. What are permits requiring? But at the same time, we've got infrastructure needs. We've got all of these things that have to be done, and they cost money. And so looking at how we can streamline those state policies to match what local communities need to do. And in some cases, we have to lead them by the nose to those solutions because, again, they're dealing with political realities that are, they're not going away. And they're dealing with their constituents at a very hyper-local level. And that hyper-locality is impacting our ability to provide housing that we need for our kids and our grandkids. And that's our focus, is to say, okay, what is it going to take to make sure that our kids and our grandkids can have access to that same opportunity, to the wealth building that's created by housing. You know, one of the most compelling numbers, I think, came from HUD, that the median net worth of a renter in the United States 2022 was $10,400. The median net worth of a homeowner in 2022 was $396,200. I mean, that's a dramatic change. And so if we don't encourage and create opportunity within our state and local areas to encourage and allow for people to generate that wealth, we know how that story ends, and it doesn't end well. So that's our focus, is really focusing on those. Again, we're gonna always have the subsidized world that we're gonna have to deal with, and we have to rely on Washington for that. But everything above that really becomes a state and local matter as to how we deal with our infrastructure needs, how we deal with our zoning reform and regulatory structures on a local level, so that we can kind of get government supportive but not necessary to the process, I think.
You know, I think that this is something that the federal government can't afford to stay on the sidelines of, and precisely because it's moved so far up the food chain, it's really a major competitiveness problem for the country. I think you see that at the state level, like, you know, when I think about Massachusetts, absolutely a large number of localities for a long time have really restricted zoning. And now you're seeing a situation where, like, we've got a great burgeoning economy and actually lots of high-paid jobs available, and then a problem filling them because of the high cost of housing. And so you're seeing the governor and the state level kind of say, hey, this is a competitiveness problem for all of us. And so we can no longer just devolve it down to the local level and hope that it'll take care of itself. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's like a level at which that's also true on the federal side. I mean, you just think about like the, you know, other countries that we're competing with and kind of like the global economy and the huge benefits of network effects, especially like when you think about innovation economies, which is one of the things that the United States has historically been really strong in. But to get all those innovators together and have them create things that create like real additional value, they have to have a place to live. And so I think like, and also like even when you're talking about very high paid innovation jobs, there are all the service jobs that come along with that, right? And everybody needs childcare and everybody needs, you know, food. And so I just think that this is something that Washington can't just punt on. And to me, there's really, I'm going to cheat and say there's two answers to your question. One, I do think that on the subsidized housing side, we do really need a significant expansion of commitment to the voucher program. I think that, and actually, the voucher program could, in theory, serve a higher AMI set of folks. Eligibility runs up higher, but most places were only serving the extremely low income because only 1 out of 4 families that qualify for a voucher get one. I think there's been really interesting proposals, including in the president's budget, to sort of make it something that veterans and foster youth just get automatically, rather than, like, in this country, if you qualify for food stamps, you get food stamps. Mm-hmm. If you qualify for the voucher program, you get put on a wait list, right? And I think that we really see the net effects of that in a really negative way. And so I think that, expanding that federal support, and as I mentioned before, it's actually a way to expand federal support for underwriting of new housing. I mean, we have an initiative in Boston to build 3,000 more units under the Faircloth limit, and those, the way that we can get those built is through the authority to borrow debt off of the future kind of vouchers backing that. But if you can't issue any more vouchers, then you can't do that, right? And so I think that that's a really important piece of the puzzle, is just doubling down on a commitment to the voucher program. And I think there's been a lot of ways in which some of the things you alluded to earlier, like some of the challenges about it historically, have been looked at, and we have best practices for how to overcome them. So I think doubling down on, hey, we want to run a good, streamlined, strong voucher program, but we want to reinvest in it. It's important. I think the second thing is this public finance point for housing. So to the point about there will never be enough government money to subsidize housing for middle income and market production, right? We would have to have just a whole different portion of GDP held by the state for that to happen. But it's very different to have to sink money into making up a gap to produce those units versus being able to invest money at a lower, more concessionary rate so as to make those things pencil in a way that they don't today. So I just think that we all got to live in the zero interest rate world, and now we're living in the world where the capital markets are just saying it's not worth it to me to take the construction risk on housing when I could have my money in treasuries. And that situation is improving. I don't think we're going to go back to the world that we used to live in. Mm-hmm. And the reality is that once we recognize that housing is essential for competitiveness and that it's a national crisis, we can't just ride the dragon of the boom-bust cycle and hope that it's going to work out for us, because we're seeing that it's not going to work out for us. The math doesn't add up. So I think when I think about how do you spend a marginal federal dollar in a way that actually could be sustainable, it's got to be with a sort of federal investment at low rate model in housing production. And I think you could then really over time change that market into less of a boom-bust and more of a consistent, the profits may not be as high in the long run, but we'd actually see more consistent housing production.
So we have a question from the virtual audience. What do you guys think can be done to increase the construction of starter homes specifically?
That sounds like it's for you, Steve.
Yeah. We've created some tools in Utah that have focused on that very issue. One of the ones we implemented this last year was utilizing our state treasury reserves as a lending mechanism, kind of to your point, to create opportunity for developers to come in and borrow money, builders to come in and borrow money at slightly below market rates or significantly below market rates, if they will do a qualified project. And a qualified project means that 60% of what they build in that project area has to be a owner-occupied home with a deed restriction for owner occupancy. It has to sell at a specified rate, and the municipality, the land use authority, has to agree to it. And what that really does is that pushes the land use authority, the municipality, to do smaller lots, because that's the only way you're going to get less expensive homes. And then the builders have to build smaller homes on those smaller lots, and they're going to have their profit margin is shrinking. Mm-hmm. But by allowing them to increase their volume by creating more lots within that space, gives them the kind of the makeup. They're not going to do as well as if they were just building the larger homes on larger lots, which we've traditionally seen, but giving them the opportunity to do those starter homes. We're talking about what we built post-World War II, the 1,000 square foot home, the 1,200 square foot home on a smaller lot. And we just had our first approval of a project like that. 275 new homes that otherwise would not have been built were added, 39% density increase. And there was a lot of public opposition. This is a little project. But people, I mean, we had the people that came in and said, you're going to kill more children, you're going to, introduce crime, and you're going to do all of these negative things by adding density. And the pushback from the elected officials and the appointed officials was, no, we're creating homeownership opportunities for our teachers and our first responders and others who we want to have live in our communities, and giving them that sort of ammunition to push back against the NIMBY world that we're all living in right now was really critical. And those 275 homes, again, if you go back to that math, represents about $110 million of net worth created for those 275 family units or groups that are going to be occupying and building wealth in those homes. So it's a huge deal.
Do we have any in-person questions? Oh, right here. Oh, there's a mic coming.
I know one thing that both Vice President Harris and Senator Vance agree on is the root cause of the housing crisis seeming to be investor ownership of single-family homes. And I know that I think it's Congressman Ro Khanna's bill. It's the Stop Wall Street Landlords Act that seems to want to challenge that at the root by denying tax deductions to corporations or private equity firms that do that by single-family homes in large quantities. I think they're targeting those that have assets of over 100 million, I think it is. And I wondered what the viability of that bill was. I mean, I guess I direct that to Mike, but anybody who has an opinion on that, the viability of that in the House, and I think it's been kicking around since like 2022, and how that stacks against something like Sherrod Brown's bill that tackles a similar premise.
Well, I would say one of the root causes, not the root cause of affordability. I think it certainly depends on what happens in 2 weeks. I don't know if there's an appetite on the Republican side for moving a bill like that. And if you look at both bills, both Sherrod Brown's bill and Ro Khanna's bill, it's all Democrats that are currently co-sponsors on the bill. I think it's an issue that, I'll let you jump in here. I think it's an issue that is becoming more talked about and prevalent. And we know a lot of the people in those industries are starting to spend a lot more time here in DC. So I think they recognize that, I don't know if it's a target on their back but they are in the crosshairs. And again, I think it does. If it was a Democratic sweep in 2 weeks, I think the viability of a bill like that moving forward is obviously greater than the inverse of that in a GOP trifecta. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that issue of that bill.
No, I think that sums it well. Steve?
We have a Republican state legislature that's actually introduced some legislation around that. It's really challenging because you have constitutional issues. You have, how do you track this thing? How do you measure what's good investment activity versus negative investment activity? And one of the things you don't want to have is this unintended consequence of wiping out market value retroactively. That's really bad for, macroeconomically, that's really tough. If we can do something prospectively that sort of limits that opportunity going forward and doesn't, sort of destroy market value going backward. But the constitutional and the practical issues of trying to track those things, if you've got a solution, I'm all ears, because I haven't heard one yet that really works functionally, given the nature of the beast.
Yeah, and I think in Boston, the greatest thing we've seen be successful is we added a down payment assistance and support program to help our BHA residents be first-time home buyers with HUD's Section 8 to home ownership program. And those supports, we went from 2 families a year using the program to 50 a year using the program. And I think that for government, one of the most effective things we can do is help those owner-occupant families compete in the market and try to sort of like tackle the transactions at that level.
And that's been our approach as well, is really to focus on the supplying the proper product so that starter homes can be built, and then giving people the tools. We have a down payment assistance program as well. It's a loan, it's not a grant, but gives people the opportunity to get into ownership. That's probably the most effective thing we can do in that space, I think.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have, but thank you guys for such a good conversation, and thanks to all of you for joining us.